So Microsoft Graph, it's well, let me tell you what Microsoft Graph is. It's a single endpoint to access data across all of Microsoft resources. Right. So Microsoft collects a lot of has a lot of resources that you need access to, and Graph is that one single endpoint. It's simple because it's one endpoint and it goes across all resources, and your administrator can grant you permissions based on the resources you want. Another reason for you to learn Microsoft Graph is because the old Graph, which is Azure AD Graph API, that's deprecated, or sorry, it'll be deprecated in December, and you'll stop getting responses from the Azure AD Graph API. Yep.
Okay.
So here we have your resources. Let's say this is your one resource, two resource, three resource, right?
Mhm.
Let's say this resource is AAD, right? This resource is
Mhm.
AAD logs. Let's say logs. This one is users.
Yeah.
This one is groups.
So
So these are your
what exactly is the
resources.
difference like? Because when we talk about resources, generally we have Azure Data Factory, Data Lakes, Databricks. So these are the different
Correct,
resources
correct.
that we have, right? So here,
Yeah,
mhm.
everything is a resource. I cannot draw those many boxes in here, right?
Mhm.
So
Correct, correct,
everything is a
correct.
resource in
In fact,
Azure,
groups and users
and
are also resources.
correct. The users are resource, groups are resource. Now, eventually when you start learning about resource groups, right, you would create a resource group and you would add your resources to it. I think you've done this in the
Mhm.
past as well, where you
Yes,
created
yes.
a RG resource group, and then in that resource group you would add your virtual machine, you would add your virtual networks, you can
Mm.
add your output from your virtual machines, right, to you can store to blob storage containers, things like that. So all of those would be in one resource group, and that resource group would be your collection of resources,
Mm.
right? It's easier for you to administer and manage stuff because you'll have everything in one resource group. And ideally, you keep your, like if you have one project, you would keep everything in that, which is related to one project in that one resource group. But now, just to make things easier for at least for me to explain it, we have these resources right now, right? So you would have one endpoint. I will quickly show you how you can find these. Just Google or Bing this. Go to uh, Graph API reference. These are your endpoints. So you would first start off with something like this. Here is your endpoint. All right. So you have your endpoint here. Let me see. You can type this in. It's too huge. So you have your endpoint. The first bit would be your endpoint, and then after that, you would add your resource to it. For example, here, this is a better example actually. So
Mm.
if I just put this, oh, so over here you have your endpoint. Let me get some colors back. So this is your Graph API endpoint. This is the version. We have version 1.0 and beta. This is your resource. The next one
Mhm.
is your resource, which is, let's keep it the same color. Resource, so it can be either groups, users, whatever. And then it's your filtering parameter, where if you do PowerShell, it's similar. Then you have your filter at the end, right after the pipe in
Okay.
PowerShell. Right. So here's your endpoint. This is for Graph, and Graph would have multiple resources connected to it. Here is a list of some resources that you can see. API reference, users, group applications, all these things are resources.
Mm.
Right? These are some of the resources that you could interact with. The mail is there, so if you're into Exchange and stuff, you would use the email bit of the Graph API endpoint.
Mhm.
So the way you create your URI string is you have your API endpoint here. This. So you would first start off with the API endpoint. Then you have your version, whatever version you would choose. go with the version 1.0 because that is a stable release. The beta one can change at any time. Yep. So you have a endpoint, then you have a resource. It could be in, like I told you about groups. Then if I just go to another resource, users. So
Users.
if I go to user, then you could see here that you want to list. If I want to list all the users, you would use something like this. This is your resource, right? So over here, I would specify the resource, which is users, and then my filtering query. You can set multiple filters in Graph API or when in your URL. You can run multiple filters, right? And what I wanted to tell you is this thing here, which is permissions. Now, you need something to authenticate, right? Remember, we talked about UPNs and SPN.
Yes.
Now, if I have an SPN, SPN, and that SPN wants access to groups, or no, in this case, you want access to users, right? So
Hmm.
this SPN wants access to users. So your administrator would have to grant you, or you would need one of these permissions. If it's an application-based permission, you need this. So since this application, of course, you do an app registration, which you register an application. That application creates a service principal, which you assign a certificate to, and then you need to give it permissions. So if I want to get a list of users in my directory, I would need user.readAll. So I'll be able to read the entire, read all the users. Or you would
Hmm.
need, sorry, no need of write. If you just want to read, me as an administrator can only give you this permission, directory.readAll, or sorry, if you want to read users only, I can limit you to only these users, right? Only this
Yes.
permission. So this SPN, when it calls this, this S, so this SPN, when it calls this API and this endpoint and this resources, it comes over here and you only get all the users, right?
Hmm.
Now, if you want to edit a user, like change any of the attributes or add users, delete users, you need this user.readWrite or directory.readWrite, right? You need to be
Hmm.
able to write to that user or write to the directory. And it would only let you do it if you have these permissions. So that is why SPNs are better than UPNs when you use it in applications, because you would code an application or you would have a lot of you would have script, right? If it's a user principal name, you either specify the your credentials in the code or you save it to your local machine as an XML file or encrypted XML file, and then you have to call it. But your code, your credentials live on the machine or your credentials live in your script. We don't want that. That's not secure because let's say you send that script to someone as a zipped file and that goes to someone else and everyone has your password and they can mess with it. So you always want to use SPNs.